When you get research on a deep level on a local issue, that's precisely when you understand the bigger picture better. It's like, in a sense, the child, we always use the image of Seamus Heaney, the late Seamus Heaney, the poet, would say, you know, we're born in a cradle and our world evolves from a very small beginning. The cradle, the room we're in, we come out onto the landing, we say, my God, the world is expanding, down to the kitchen. And the first day we go to the garden, and then we go down the lane, and we see the small road. We go into the big world, we eventually end up in New York. But really we know ourselves. Sometimes when we're really stressed, where do we want to go? We want to go back into this cradle, back to our mother, back to our home, because that's where the formative influences in our brains, in our hardwiring is formed, and that's absolutely true. The local is fundamental. The local is central to our understanding. We start off, if you understand the home turf really well, they're the people who understand the world well. In Ireland, when I was going to school, we were brainwashed in a sense, or as Ruth learned, the industries of Britain, the industries of Russia, South American farming and so forth. And the town I lived in was Bagenstown, and nobody talked about the local river, the second biggest in the country, or the mountain at her back door, Mount Leinster, the biggest in Leinster. There was almost a shame. It was a kind of an imperial residue or legacy that whatever was local was useless. It never did anything. All we were seeing here, we're seeing people get the train and the boat out of it, and we saw poverty, unemployment, lack of progress really. So the local must be useless. The big smoke was where everything was. It was Dublin or London, New York, Buenos Aires for people from around Westmeath. And of course that was fundamentally wrong. There's been a rediscovery of the local.
Speaking personally, I've always had a passion for history, and history is really storytelling. It's saying, you know, this is what happened. We can debate, and historians will, about, you know, why it happened and the motivations of people and all of that. But to say that, you know, these things happened, and, you know, this is what life was like for people. And, you know, even there are things, for example, I mean, we tend to focus on that decade with, you know, and the nationalist things and Sinn Féin and the campaign for Irish independence, but discover again, you know, the kind of lives their ancestors lived, what their experiences were to live through that time, to sort of maybe to have a better understanding of the events that happened and why they happened. As specifically relating to the Civil War, because that is something that for so long people didn't really want to go near because it was so painful to go near it to.
We've gone through a really important, significant and really beneficial project. It's called the Decade of Centenaries. I suppose the iconic date in Ireland, to a large extent, we often think of the Battle of Clontarf, Battle of the Boyne, but in the modern era, or the famine in fact prior to that, 1845-49, is 1916. It's really a defining moment. It seemed to be nothing and it evolved into a major event. That was, in a sense, that was kicking off in a big sense what the Decade of Centenaries was about, because that was from the lockout 1913 to the end of the Civil War, 1923, often referred to as the revolutionary period in Irish history, a really formative moment in our history. It's been a very successful policy move by the government, particularly in the sense of helping out local communities to look at, to examine, and particularly to look at their own area, how these big events played out in Westmeath or in the surrounding Midlands and so forth. So we were really involved in that, and we've learned an awful lot from it. It's been very positive, very positive. And I want to emphasise there as well, Westmeath County Council have been extremely supportive. I'd like to mention that. Throughout the Decade of Centenaries, particularly the Heritage Officer, Melanie McKevitt. She's a marvellous addition to Heritage in the county. She's here a number of years now, comes to all our lectures and is extremely supportive.
It's important we do this, and why I feel it's important. We walk through the streets of Mullingar today. Okay? We're free, okay? And you know, people want to go to Mass, they can. If they want to go to the Protestant church, they can. We're free. Our ancestors didn't have that freedom. And it's important that we keep reminding each other of where we are and thank God for what we have now, but also to remind people that, look, this freedom we have didn't come easy. And I think it's so important that people are reminded of that freedom is not free. People have to sacrifice a lot of time and even their lives to give us the freedom we have today.
So over the last decade, this Decade of Centenaries, the Westmeath Archaeological and Historical Society, of which I'm the president, we have been doing sort of annual conferences, putting together journals, doing other pieces to mark this very significant decade in Irish and Westmeath history.
Really, you couldn't emphasise enough, as we look back on it now, it's been successful because we've had publications which are there forever. We've had conferences that have been well attended, and we've had really well attended lectures, and we've had, you know, people from the universities, from public office, a wide variety of people have contributed to the lectures, which I think have been successful, and I think that's an important part of the story up around here.
You know, history is always very exciting, and there, for generations, particularly with regard to things like the Civil War, because the Civil War was never really taught in schools. It was such a sensitive issue that for many decades it was actually avoided. I think it was the journalist Jean Kerrigan who said once he actually left school at the end of the 1960s unaware there had been a civil war in Ireland because it really wasn't touched on. So we're trying to, you know, to look at events like that and the impact they had and the involvement, putting it from the national picture to the local picture of how it actually impacted on this town and on this county and what went on here, and tried to sort of kind of put it into the kind of context of the wider national and international events at the time.
Why is the local significant? When really you would say, you know, we're a centralised government, national issues take precedence. I would challenge that very much. People live here in Mullingar, they live in North Westmeath. That's the experience they have every day, as they go to school, go to church, go to entertainment, go to the lakes or whatever, and they're passing by a castle, a ring fort, or a monument, or an old church, or whatever. That's what's really relevant to them.
A lot of people involved in the historical societies here would have had perhaps family connections to the First World War, to the War of Independence, the Civil War. One of the things that I've been writing about recently in connection with the Civil War was a tragedy that happened down at the waterworks here in Mullingar, the old pumping station near Cusack Park. where it was being guarded by troops during the Civil War because the Republicans had blown up waterworks in other towns, so they were afraid this one would be attacked. In fact, it wasn't, but there was this tragedy where one soldier accidentally shot dead another soldier, and the description of things and how the dying man, the soldier, was carried across from the pumping station yard. We brought him over to Mr. Raleig's house, and Mr. Raleigh was my grandfather. And my Uncle Paddy, who would have been 4.5 at the time, all his life he was kind of haunted by this thing. He would feel a bit squeamish if he nicked himself shaving, something like that, because he had this memory of seeing this trail of blood kind of all along the yard and the road where this poor man who was shot, an artery had been severed, so there was blood everywhere. And this soldier who died, he'd used to bring, apparently some of the soldiers that bring my uncle up to school. He just started school then, and so he had all this memory of this soldier who had been, brought him to school and now was dead, and and that the blood, that it took a long time to get all the blood off the yard apparently, and he remembered that. And that sort of thing, so kind of the stories like that.
I've always been interested in history because I suppose my background, I come from a military family, and I suppose my brothers and sisters and I, we have a wonderful mother and father, but we spent an awful lot of our time at our grandparents' house in Grand Parade up here beside the army barracks. So, my granny, around the time of the executions of Michael Greeley and Luke Burke, actually was a child during that period in 1923. The army barracks, that's where my father served, my uncle served, my granddad served, and even my great-granddad served in the barracks in Mullingar. And many years later, I served there as an army reservist for over 20 years, nearly 25 years in Collin Barracks before it closed. And so I said I needed to find out more about who were these men. And it was very hard when, you ask around, I don't know his name, or there was two fellas, and no one could pinpoint what the names were, who they were, why they were. And that part was kind of lost. So I remember a number of years ago, I was talking to Father Declan Hurley, who was a priest of Mullingar, and of course he was like me, big into history, and he was able to give me some of the names, because obviously with the archives in the Meath diocese there, he was able to get access. So I again research further on this. But of course, like everything in life, I wanted to find out more, but work got in the way. I'm a teacher, I'm busy doing other stuff. I went back to university, I studied, I got my degrees, whatever. And that kind of took priority, and kind of my historical research into both men in that period it was kind of just put aside. But I have to say, during this period, there was a local author in the Westmeath area. He used to live in Mullingar, Peter Rogers, and he then carried out research on this. And it's a fantastic piece of research. So when I got time then to write myself in this, I decided, look, Peter has looked really, and he's done it excellently where he looked at the bank rates. My issue was when I started researching again, and it was actually thanks to the editor, Seamus O'Brien. He said, look, Jay, you've done a lot of research in history, Collin Barracks, we don't know anything about it. I want you to write this for me for the book chapter. Would you do it? And I said, okay, Seamus, thank you for asking. So I found myself in military archives in Dublin, in Castlebrewer Barracks. And when I was searching both men, you're seeing they're put down as civilians. And yet this is not corresponding with what I'm hearing. So I'm in military archives, and like that destruction order you've seen where all the files and documents when Cumann na Gael was coming out of power and Fianna Fáil were coming in, they were destroyed. There was a big fear that there could have been a civil war 10 years later. Had the scene, who killed my friend, who killed my brother, So I'm here with the bits of files and documents that survive of Michael Greeley, Luke Burke. I'm in Castlebrewer Barracks in Dublin, and I have some military archives were brilliant. So I went in, and next thing, the files and documents are coming up, and these are primary source documents. These are real deal stuff, the surviving ones, and it's execute irregulars. Now, as a historian, when we heard the term irregular, that was the Irish state's terminology for anti-treaty IRA. Like, you weren't allowed to be called, that's a Republican, or that's your member of IRA. They were kind of dissed, to use that term. So they were known as irregulars. In other words, they were othered. So I said, hang on, irregular. In other words, these were members of Oak Nair, these weren't civilians. But my area where I'm looking at in these two gentlemen was actually the fact that there were officers in the IRA was taken off them. They were civilians. And I have to say, through my research, That is an untruth, and that is a lie, and that is shadow has been allowed to hang over both men and their families for 100 years, and it just needs to end now, and the record needs to be put straight. We have to face on our histories whether we like it or not. And it's as simple as that. History is not about all the Gucci stuff. History is about the tough stuff, the stuff that makes us cry, the stuff that makes us go, oh, I didn't realise that. The stuff that makes us feel uneasy. That's what history's about. And that's how I view this. I mean, as I said, you park your politics to the rear. You park all your subconscious beliefs to the rear. And you go in there objectively. And you say, right, I'm looking at this with a fresh lens. Because if you don't do that, you're serving an injustice to history and historical research.
You know, the involvement of women, the Commemorated women here in Mullingar. One of the things, Mullingar tidy towns, but up there are the beautiful memorial garden, and Jason was involved with that too, is they commemorating all those who served here from the 1916-21 period. And there are plans to put up a specific plaque to commemorate the Commemorated, because I think one of the problems here was the men here there were commemorations, they were remembered, they had gatherings, there were a lot done the time of the 50th anniversary of the Rising, but the women were kind of overshadowed. So it's one of the works we've done consistently throughout this decade is, you know, to focus in, you know, the women, what life was like for the women of Westmeath and Mullingar during that decade.
You know, it's a very important part of the culture of a community. There were difficult things to be discussed, particularly the Civil War, where you had people killed here in town. You've had RIC, men murdered here, assassinated in the county. Difficult areas to look at. It's not black and white. You've had members, for argument's sake, of the Church of Ireland community were put under stress, where their premises were attacked, some were burnt out, some were intimidated. So you had all those things happened, and there had to be examined in the round. And there was also a need to look at it in a balanced fashion, that it wasn't just them and us, it's both and. So that's one of the aspects of it I think has been good.
You know, other areas as well, the First World War, because the First World War was really not something that was very much talked about. Even in school histories, it was, yes, you learned about the First World War, but with no sense or no awareness that thousands and thousands of Irish people served in that war. I mean, there's a very famous photograph, which I remember seeing in school history books, showing a group of men in a trench on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, but with no idea that they were actually Irishmen. But they were from the Royal Irish Rifles, and it's been again one of the things that our historical societies here in Westmeath and our Heritage Office and others have tried to do, is to make people aware of how much the First World War impacted on this county and this town. I had no idea of how many from this town had died. I thought it was about 50 or 60. In fact, it was around 300. That's from a town with a population at that time of about 5,000. You know, there were streets in this town which, there were houses in places like Barrack Street and Mill Road, where one house, two brothers from one house died, and then two brothers from another house. And a woman from this town died in the sinking of the Lusitania, or a couple of years later her brother was killed on the Western Front. And that had really nearly been unspoken, forgotten about, because I suppose it was complicated. How do you commemorate Irishmen who died wearing the uniform of the British military? But, you know, They were part of our town, part of our society. They're our grandfathers, our uncles, and they need to be remembered. And I think one of the things we've tried to do during the Decade of Centenary is remember them.
But the localism, I'm fascinated by it. I spent all my time researching local issues. I think the poet Paddy Kavanagh summed it up well. He was a marvellous observer. He was in Inishkeen and Monaghan. We talked about the undying difference in the corner of the field, and I think it just captures it. You know, you go around Westmeath here, you might see an old circular gatepost made of stone. You'd have to stop the car and look at it, or a wall, a stone wall, or a thatched house, a mud-walled house, or a ring fort, or something like that that's in the local area, or just a stump of a castle, or an old church, or a headstone in a graveyard. You know, it's just, that's the magic. And of course, that's why the important, that's accessible to us. We can walk to it, go on our bike, or get in a car and go to it. It's right beside us. It's always available. But the more you know about it, the more excited you can become about it. It helps to build community in a place like Mullingar. You know, because we're very near Dublin, there's motorways and a train every hour. You can be sucked into that larger conurbation. But you must develop, you know, there's a whole series of levers and systems to go to develop a community. One could be religion, for example. Other could be sport. But part of that part of that jigsaw is most definitely, in the cultural sense, is heritage and history.